You're listening to the Art of Citizenry Podcast. I'm your host, Manpreet Kaur Kalra. This community-supported show is dedicated to reframing the issues of our time and imagining a more equitable, restorative future. Today's conversation explores a topic I am particularly passionate about, storytelling, and how the stories we tell shape our understanding of truth, power, and accountability. Stories aren't just how we make sense of the world. They're how power is built, maintained, and challenged. The way a story is told and who gets to tell it can determine whose pain is seen, whose resistance is remembered, and whose voices are erased. In this episode, we're unpacking how narratives shape systems, from media and politics to culture and identity, and what it means to reclaim storytelling as an act of justice. Because when we change who tells the story, we change what becomes possible. I am joined by journalist Noor Tagouri, whose work poses the disarming task of self-reflection. She's the founder of At Your Service, a company built on the idea that storytelling can be an act of care for ourselves, for our communities, the people whose lives are at the center of the work, and the stories themselves. From self-investigation to how stories are shaped and told, we explore themes that help us reimagine storytelling and the evolving role of journalists. I want to start by grounding this conversation in your journey. What drew you to storytelling and journalism?
I studied investigative journalism and conflict management, and I have just always known that I wanted to be a storyteller or journalist because I was always asking questions as a kid. I always felt like that was my skill set. I wasn't very good at art and sports, but I was very good at asking questions. And when I was really young, my dad was like, there's a name for this thing that you love to do so much. It's called journalism. And so I was always focused on just that path. And I was very dedicated and committed to pursuing it. And I had these really big dreams of wanting to pursue journalism in the traditional sense and traditional and legacy media. At the time, I was covering my hair, I was wearing the hijab. And so that hadn't happened. Having a Muslim woman in a hijab as a news anchor or reporter on mainstream American television hadn't happened. So I was dedicated to that, to breaking that barrier in the pursuit of telling the stories I wanted to tell. And it's been really interesting because the path really put me eventually onto independent storytelling and independent journalism for about the last 10 years. And now we're seeing this complete shift in the media landscape that is really forcing so many journalists to pursue this path. It's an interesting time right now to look at the holes in our industry.
That makes me reflect on my own experience as a storyteller, because what you're naming lands for so many of us who have moved outside of legacy structures to protect the integrity of our work, telling stories on issues that matter to us, or stories of our own communities that challenge dominant narratives that are not created by us and aren't sanitized for someone else's comfort and approval. Personally, I believe the shift to independent storytelling isn't just about platforms. It's about freedom to ask the questions that actually need to be asked. It sounds like, similar to what I believe so many of us can relate to, your first signal wasn't misrepresentation, it was absence.
I grew up in a very conservative, very white town where there weren't really any Muslims or Muslims in my school besides my cousin and I. And I think the initial experience was just this deep feeling of shame and embarrassment around my identity, but not really having the language and the understanding of why that was. And the entry point was really the lack of representation. It wasn't even misrepresentation at first. It was the lack of representation. It was not seeing anybody on television that looked like my mom or looked like my family members. And at that time too, it was very particularly very blonde and very blue-eyed. And I always thought that that's what you had to look like. And that's why I was so inspired by people like Oprah or Lisa Ling or Soledad O'Brien or Christiana Monpour, because I was like, wait, they don't look like the people on my local news.
It's such a complicated feeling because when I see representation, even the smallest bit, I feel this rush of pride or I suppose excitement in the recognition. Like finally, someone who looks like me or my family or my community. But it's also heartbreaking that we're still grasping at scraps, celebrating those tiny moments because they're all we get. That's why community centered storytelling is so important. It builds enough presence that we're not clinging to one or two rare examples, but actually normalizing our stories in these spaces.
Yeah, I think that is why this moment in time is actually really interesting because there's so many independent storytellers. Now things are more accessible for us to find who may be telling the stories that would connect with us deeper. And so I actually think it was the lack of representation that put me on the path, which was like, how can I just create a place for myself in this industry and in this space where I can represent myself? And I think, of course, there was also the pressure to represent a people.
That simple realization to be seen as you are. Being seen can feel like a relief, but representation alone can feel so hollow when its purpose is just a checkbox, or worse, when it just reinforces harmful tropes and stereotypes about communities and cultures. Identities get put into boxes, which is challenging because no one person can represent an entire people. We are not monoliths, and yet our narratives are flattened and funneled often into a single story.
When Muslims were represented, specifically in the news, it was always adjacent to language around terrorism or something war related. And then the Back to the Future scene, the opening scene where Doc and Marty are running from Libyan terrorists who are like these barbaric men, that really was a turning point, but not until later, because I didn't even realize that they were Libyan. Like, I guess I hadn't watched the movie until much later. But my family comes from Libya. And of course, that story is a story that I speak about deeply because it was in relation to a bombing that the US conducted in Libya that impacted my family.
Would you be comfortable sharing your family story and how it became a doorway to your work today?
Yeah, I come from a lineage of storytellers, documentarians, archivists, writers. And the story that I was referencing is a story in my family's lineage, which is that in 1986, Ronald Reagan conducted an airstrike in Libya in an attempt to assassinate the dictator Gaddafi. But they actually ended up hitting a residential apartment complex where 5 of my family members were sleeping and died. And my great uncle at the time, who was this like Libyan cowboy in Oklahoma, was at his son's Little League game. And he had this 2-inch black and white TV that he would carry around. He was a news junkie. He loved watching the news, and he was watching the news at his son's Little League game. And then there was the White House press conference about the airstrike. And because of the location that they had mentioned, he ran home and he called his family in Libya and told them to go check on the family because he feared that they had vanished. And they went, and the building was gone, and they found body parts and vases, but they didn't find anybody intact. And this story had always been like this thing in our family, this like lore that wasn't like openly just like talked about because it was still such an open wound, but we all knew that it happened. And if we asked about it, okay, then we could talk about it. It wasn't like anybody was avoiding it. It just, it's still a trauma that is felt. And I, in this project Rep, the story about the stories we tell, which is this audio investigation podcast, my intention for pursuing this story was asking myself, how has the misrepresentation of Muslims and Arabs in American media shaped American culture and society as a whole? And I had really been interested in turning the questions inward and starting from a place of accountability and looking at myself and my own family and my own story. And so in pursuit of starting the story from the inside out, I pursued a story about the story of our family that I had a big question mark around, which now, I advise people to do. And I've shared this with my students when I taught this body of work at a university, and they also created their own rep projects. And the entry point was, what is like a story in your family that you know is there, but nobody's really penetrated? And it's such a fantastic entry point for self-investigation. And so that's what I did. And my great uncle at the time had recorded hours and hours of archival footage of just all the news coverage of the bombing. So I had gone through that, the footage, and my little brother, who was probably 11 at the time, had just watched Back to the Future. And we had talked about the opening scene about the Libyans. And then I curiously was just like, I wonder when this came out in relation to when the bombing happened. And it had come out 9 months earlier as like a summer blockbuster. And I just thought that's really crazy that this film came out portraying these Libyans as like barbaric terrorists. And then the bombing happened. So how did that representation actually assuage the public opinion about how we would conduct an airstrike and kill people that we were desensitized to?
What you're describing shows how media doesn't just mirror the world, it conditions it. Pop culture builds familiarity. Familiarity softens resistance. That's why these portrayals matter. They're not harmless entertainment. They shape collective memory, and they influence what people come to see as normal or inevitable. You've developed a framework that helps unpack this relationship. Can you walk us through how you think about these elements in your work?
Yeah. I mean, we called the tool the 3 Ps: politics, pop culture, and public opinion. And I feel like the 3 Ps are a really good tool or pattern for anybody in their lives to play around with and explore for the stories that are coming up for them. Because all 3 of those things impact one another. So I think having the ability to just be like, okay, what are the policies that are impacting you, or what are the stories that are shaping you? And then how can you create a web from that connects the other 2 Ps that allow you to really give you a better picture and understanding so that you can then ask yourself, what is the role that I'm playing in this problem? Because at the end of the day, like, that was really the question that I kept coming back to, is like, okay, and what is the role that I play, or what is my responsibility?
This really goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the difference between visibility and authenticity. Representation is often reduced to optics, to who's in the frame or on the panel, but real representation, I believe, has to be rooted in truth and accountability. I'm curious, in your view, what does authentic representation actually demand of us and of the institutions that shape public narratives? Because we're living through a very challenging moment right now. And I think a growing concern is whether we're focusing on the right things. We're seeing institutions scale back their diversity commitments and hiring initiatives, and it raises the decades-old question: is progress really measured by simply having more people of color in the room because we can quantify that and it feels tangible? Or by whether these people have real power to shape decisions, which is much harder to measure? So I suppose that makes me reflect on how symbolic representation often distracts from meaningful inclusion.
I mean, one of the questions that a friend of mine, Najma Sharif, asks, is representation the thing that we need, or is it more collaboration? Is it more of building together? And I think that for personally what I've been feeling and experiencing, in this like anti-DEI era of politics, is that a lot of times the representation and the tokenization that we were seeing, we were being used. It made strides, but it didn't necessarily penetrate the culture in the ways that we had hoped. And maybe that's also because, as I'm saying that I'm thinking about this, maybe that's also because it didn't have enough time to do that, because, it just really started picking up and then we had it taken away. But also I feel like the fact that we've seen such a drastic just erasure of that as a priority also shows that it was very performative and it wasn't necessarily substantial, because people are too afraid to continue implementing it, or even recognizing what the value wasn't the representation in the way that a lot of corporations and institutions saw, which was like a diversity checkbox. The value was that with the diversity, equity, and inclusion, we are actually bettering our institutions, we're bettering our organizations, we're bettering our culture, we're bettering our society, because we are creating a pulse behind how expansive it actually is. And then it makes me wonder and ask the question, well, how afraid are people actually of expansion?
I really think at the heart of this is the fear of giving up power. Expansion means effectively expanding who gets to tell stories. That shifts who holds power. And that's where people panic. That refusal to relinquish power is driving so much of the current backlash against diversity, equity, and inclusion. Corporations have been waiting for the first opportunity to walk back their DEI commitments, which means they were never about systems change. They were all about optics. And it's not just a US phenomena or something tied to one administration. We've seen versions of this before, and we're seeing it globally today, a reactionary clampdown, I suppose. So if inclusion can disappear that easily, then what we had wasn't progress. It was a performance. The way representation has been implemented up to this point can't be the model of how we move forward. So when we talk about system change, representation alone obviously isn't enough, especially when the representation we did see was often shaped by the same capitalist incentives that created the exclusion in the first place. So I think about culture, and as a culture, we've seen that we have the power to set new expectations, to demand better from power structures. But what's often missing is the follow through, the deeper willingness to evolve and do the hard work of learning to see and respect another's lived experience without trying to commodify them. So I suppose that opens us to a larger question. What cultural norms and practices among creators, audiences, founders, even platforms have to shift for inclusion to be something that transforms culture rather than just markets?
There needs to be a recalibration of the intention of what it is that we want representation to actually play a role in. Is representation really the best pathway for you to sell a product? Or is it a better pathway or a better entry point for you to be a part of an active conversation in culture? And so there are some brands, I think, that are in institutions that, honestly, like, put the money in the places that deserve it, in the people that deserve it, and take a back seat. I think it's on also the people who are the ones who are coming in as like representatives to have their own like values in place. So what are the types of institutions that you're willing to take money from or that you're willing to work with? And what is the power dynamic that's going to be at play? What is the power and the freedom that they're giving you around the story that you want to tell? How prioritized is freedom for you? So turn the questions back inward. But for brands and institutions in particular, I'm like, just be generous with putting the money and backing the people who are actually doing the hard work that maybe you won't be able to do. It's like this redistribution of wealth and of resources, because for so many of us, especially who are in the independent space, like for the most part, I put mostly my own personal money behind the stories that I want to tell so that I have freedom to tell them the way that I want to tell them. It's not very sustainable, but it's just more important for us that we do that. And so then if you continue on that thread, how do you make it more sustainable? Well, it's investing more in your own community, because that's the thing. It's like a lot of times we're also really good at creating and building a community and engaging with community from a place of trust.
Our conversations also make me reflect on a theme that comes up a lot in storytelling work, especially impact storytelling. The question of, when does storytelling create the transformation we hope for? And when does it actually re-traumatize the very communities we're trying to uplift? I share this as something I've spent quite a bit of time reflecting on and dissecting within my work in impact storytelling, because sometimes we feel compelled to share very painful parts of our lives, not because we're ready, but because we've been made to believe that vulnerability is the only way our stories will matter or be impactful enough. And when you hold an identity that's highly visible, or when you're representing a community or a lived experience that's often misunderstood, that responsibility can feel enormous. That pressure intensifies. There's this unspoken expectation that you're representing your entire community every time you speak. I know for myself, as a Sikh woman raised in the diaspora, I can speak from my own experience, but I can't speak for everyone who shares elements of the same religio-cultural identity as me. And yet, when representation is so scarce, you inevitably become a stand-in for something much bigger than yourself. So I want to dig into that tension a bit. The line between storytelling that heals and storytelling that harms.
I remember I was speaking in Dallas many years ago, and this woman, this like mom, stood up and in tears, and she was like, I just want to be allowed to have a bad day. I want to be allowed to like I have to like smile and look at people or whatever so that they don't think that I'm oppressed. And it was such an emotional turning point in the conversation because we should all be allowed to. It actually helped me realize to myself how much performance there is in just being who you are. And I think that is also why I believe self-investigation is so important, to be able to investigate who you are and how you show up in the world and what it is that you believe and why you are the way that you are, so that you understand when you are performing or when you are being truly yourself, and when you are, a version of yourself, depending on who the person is. All of these things have been so important to me in my own journey, because I'm like, wait. I was put in this position. I was told I was representing over a billion people. I was told that I had that weight on me from when I was a teenager. That doesn't really make any sense, but why was that weight put on me? And then how did I mold my identity in reaction to that? And then what gifts did that give me? But also what heaviness and burdens did that give me? And I think that what you were saying about, sometimes telling these stories can be re-traumatizing. My friend Mari Andrew, who's a writer, always says that, telling a story from a place of active trauma isn't really a service to anyone. But a lot of times we're put into that position. I mean, I think about this all the time with local news. It was one of my biggest qualms with local news. You have this person who just lost their house in a fire, and then immediately you put a camera in their face and you're like, and how do you feel about the fact that you've lost everything and they haven't even processed it yet? And that's just not human. That's not kind. It's not compassionate. But how beautiful is it when after somebody has reflected on something and then they feel ready enough to share, that they're able to share from this place of having processed and wanting to be seen and wanting to add their story to the cultural zeitgeist, if that's what they choose. And they don't, and I always say people don't owe us their stories, but there's an episode in Rep called Shikata Ganai, where I interview 4 generations of Japanese Americans, elders who had been interned in camps, and they were in their 90s and they were sharing their stories for the first time with their children around. And it was such a powerful healing because they were able to admit their own, the shame that they felt around not feeling like they were allowed to learn their language or not wanting to. It's like, yes, I felt that way, but also for you, it was illegal for you to learn your language, and piecing together those things. And, that can be really, really, really powerful when the person is ready and when the storyteller can hold a container that is safe enough and comfortable enough to just hold all of the truth that comes with whatever it is that they have to say and not have any intention of trying to control that. We were taught as journalists to go into a story with a pre-written script. You're choosing what the story actually is instead of letting the story reveal itself.
What you're describing really exposes how traditional journalism has conditioned us to control stories rather than listen to them. That pre-written approach, going in with a script and searching for confirmation, is part of why public trust in media has eroded so deeply. It prioritizes efficiency over empathy, predefined narratives over nuance, outcome over process, when in reality, storytelling is a creative and collaborative act, one that should allow truth to unfold rather than be extracted. When we lead with curiosity instead of control, new narratives have a chance to emerge, narratives that reflect the complexity of real people rather than what fits the headline. So, when we allow a story to reveal itself in its fullness and complexity, the question becomes, how do we practice solidarity within that process? How do we stay connected with one another's humanity while also giving each story the freedom to stand on its own? For me, solidarity means being there fully without trying to take the mic or define the path. It's trusting communities to lead their own fight and using whatever power you have to make their voice louder, not yours. Solidarity is presence, it's responsibility, it's the belief that none of us are free alone, recognizing that our liberation and freedom is interconnected.
Yeah, that's really beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. For me, I think solidarity is giving people the space to explore their identities and go on their own journeys and make sure that they're supported along the way, even if those journeys look differently than yours, so long as no one is imposing or creating harm. I find that a lot of times it's something called horizontal hostility, where there's hostility amongst groups that have shared values because there are a lack of resources, there is a lack of representation. So I'm interested right now in what does it mean to have grace and give breathing space for people to explore and to self-investigate and to ask really hard questions, especially when they grow up in religious communities or culturally conservative communities. And how do we expand our solidarity or our responsibility beyond the people who just look and think and believe like us? And with that caveat, obviously, so long as there's no harm being done or so long as there's no harm being imposed, because that's my red line is like, I want to protect people's right to like go on their journey and also protect. And part of that is protecting their rights and protecting their rights to live in the body that they do, to choose what they do with their body, to choose how they show up, to the path that they pursue, especially in a so-called free country. And that is just what I'm really interested in right now. What does that protection look like? That to me is solidarity, is like, how do we show up for people who those rights are being infringed?
What you're describing feels so connected to storytelling itself. The idea of honoring freedom, both our own and that of others, without crossing into control or harm. It's such a delicate balance because solidarity can be powerful, but it can also be misused. When it's performative or conditional, it starts to fracture trust instead of building it. I think that tension is playing out everywhere right now, even in social movement spaces. We are watching solidarity become something that can unite or divide, depending on who's defining it. And that's where accountability and storytelling overlap for me. Storytelling at its best still has the power to remind us of our shared humanity. But when it's stripped of context or manipulated for an agenda, it does the opposite. Too often, stories are treated as a tool for persuasion instead of truth. May it be to sell something or even fundraise, and yet storytelling remains one of the most powerful ways to build understanding and reclaim empathy. So in this moment where traditional journalism is losing credibility and independent storytellers are redefining narratives and what they can look like, what would you like to see thrive? How do we build something more responsible, more sustainable, and more in service to the communities it represents?
What I hope to see thrive in the movement of impact storytelling is that the storytellers are getting the resources that they need to be able to do the work that actually allows for integrity and ethical journalism and storytelling. I don't believe necessarily that you need a journalism degree to be able to do journalism at all. I mean, there's always been citizen journalists. And I think that, like we said, that the tenets of journalism are also evolving. What I do think is really important is that the intention behind impact storytelling, and this is not a controversial take, but it's just not the direction and what people are going in. But I am more interested in people being incredibly transparent about their process and building trust with people than focusing on trying to change people's minds and to try to impose an agenda. Because I do think that there are a lot of like content creators and storytellers who their job right now, they're being funded and their job right now is to push a political agenda or a specific agenda. And I mean, that's how we got the administration that we got, because they were pumping money into content creators and journalists, storytellers, or whatever it was, that were actively feeding their audience a very specific narrative. And now I'm seeing that everybody's trying to do that, to be able to be like, let's push it this way, let's push it that way, instead of actually focusing on showing people their process and showing people how to come to better conclusions of thoughts and ideas themselves. That's what journalism originally was supposed to be. You provide information and then you allow people to make decisions for themselves. What I'm focusing on right now is I want to show people how to self-investigate to the point where they're able to engage with stories. And because you can't escape people, like the propaganda and people trying to change how you're thinking and to catch you and like implement their opinion onto you. Now I'm more interested in what is my role in showing people that there are steps that they can take, or there's a different way of thinking that allows them to be able to be more conscious of what their ideas and their beliefs and their stories actually are, so that they're just better engaged citizens. Like, because I'm not really interested in like everybody being like brainwashed and manipulated into thinking one way or another, because at the end of the day, when that's the intention, the powers that are supporting that, they're not that different from one another. I'm interested in people like really like remembering who they are as individuals, so that they can also remember their humanity. They can also remember their compassion, their empathy, so that they can remember like what it means to be a human in this world and not just like a political pawn.
I often think about autonomy, the ability for people to both tell their own stories without the lens of another and engage with stories to form their own understandings rather than being told what to think. And that feels like such a critical reminder right now, because so much of our media ecosystem depends on outrage and oversimplification. The nuance is often compromised for click-worthy captions. The goal isn't always to inform, it's often to persuade or divide, all while profiting from people's attention. What you are describing asks something harder of both the storyteller and the audience. It asks us to slow down, to question our own assumptions, and take responsibility for how we process what we see and share. That level of self-awareness is a form of civic responsibility too. So reflecting on that, how has that commitment to autonomy and curiosity shaped your own storytelling practice? And what does self-investigation look like for you in that process?
Self-investigation has helped me shape stories because it has allowed me to be bold enough to ask questions I'm really afraid to ask out loud myself. And also it has allowed me to explore stories through a lens of questions rather than perioded answers. My stories have always been this way. I mean, I remember when I produced Sold in America, my investigative series on the sex trade in the US, one of the biggest like things that people would say about it is, what's cool about this body of work is that it's not telling you all of the answers of like, then this is what we have to do, and this is what we have to believe, and this is the policy we have to pass. It was laying things out and giving people questions and tools to think about, what is the role that I'm playing in this problem, and what is it that I think could happen. And when you look at things from that lens of questions, and that becomes more of your habit and how you think, you're less inclined to impose your beliefs onto people, try to impose, and by imposing your beliefs also, being okay with their rights being revoked, because then you're thinking about the space that it requires and the freedom that it requires to be able to ask those questions out loud. And maybe my hope is that then you think about not wanting to protect other people's right to go on their own journey so that they can do that work. I recognize that it is still a privilege that I can ask certain questions out loud, even when, rights are being cinched right now. So I really am, that's what I'm interested in, because in that place of open question asking, there's more room for exploration and curiosity and connectedness. I'm just so tired of like scrolling and seeing like the same types of headlines and opinions being shouted. And by the way, so many, like when you are starting to hear people say the same words and the same lines over and over again, it's because for a lot of them, they're being paid to say those exact lines, getting press releases, or we're being told, hey, this is what we want you to say next. I've seen it with my own eyes. I've seen the money with my own eyes. And I'm just like, damn, we're really just like turning people into sheep. And that's kind of a scary thing for me.
In a time when so many people feel powerless or overwhelmed by the noise, this is the part we can control, the work of self-examination. We have the ability to ask harder questions of ourselves, to notice how our own biases might shape how we interpret what we hear, see, watch. It's not comfortable work, but it's deeply empowering and critical to our ability to be a more informed citizenry that creates spaces for others' experiences, especially experiences different from our own, to exist. That radical honesty isn't just a moral stance. It's a practice of reclaiming our capacity to think critically about the stories that shape our world and our place in it. So, how does radical honesty inform the way you tell stories?
Self-investigation to me is investigating your identity, your stories, and your beliefs, and being able to embark on what I call the quest of a question. So any of the questions that like are spinning around in your head that consistently nag at you, that you can go on the adventure of asking those hard questions out loud about who you are and why you are alive. And it's using journalistic tools that I would use to investigate any other topic, but turning that inward. And so I'm working on a book about this. I've written a guide about this. This is like the work that I'm really focused on right now, is how do we give people the tools and the space to be able to turn those hard questions inwards so that people can ask themselves, what is the role that I play in this problem? How do I take accountability for my own life and my own story? And what is my relationship with the stories I'm telling about myself and about others?
Representation isn't the destination. Equity and safety through accountability and curiosity are. We should challenge ourselves to examine our own relationship to truth, to question not just the stories we consume, but the ones we tell ourselves. This conversation reminds us that storytelling isn't neutral. Whether we're journalists, creators, or simply participants in culture, we're constantly shaping narratives, deciding whose experiences we center, what we normalize, and what we ignore. Practicing self-investigation means noticing the stories that guide our choices, the assumptions we repeat, the fears we inherit, and the power we hold to unlearn them. The most practical form of solidarity might begin there, in choosing to listen longer, to interrogate our own biases, to create with integrity, even when it's inconvenient. Because the more honestly we examine our place in a story, the more capable we become of changing its direction. This conversation is an invitation to listen deeply, to ask the hard questions, and serve the story, not yourself. Thank you to Noor Tagouri for joining me in conversation and for the perspective she brings to the stories she tells. Art of Citizenry is entirely listener supported. I hope you'll consider contributing to artofcitizenry.com/support. Please remember to subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts and give it 5 stars. Thank you to our producer, Ali Honore, and editor, Stephen Blevins. Original theme music is by Katrina Zembra.